Well, dobry wieczór. This talk, I'm here to talk to you tonight about bootstrapping your career in computer science and software engineering using open source. So the alternate title is Career Advice from Someone Who's Almost Old Enough to Be Your Father. Not quite, hopefully. So, who am I? Why have I been inflicted upon you? Why should you pay any attention to me whatsoever? Well, I come from a city of about 2 million people called Perth in Western Australia. We're the little dot down on the west of the coast there. We like to claim ourselves as the most isolated capital city in the world. It's a 2.5-hour flight to the nearest city of any size. We have 4 universities in that city, and so they all have various reputations internationally in their fields. In particular, I come from a university, or my undergraduate degree and my postgraduate degree was from a university called Curtin University of Technology. I'm an alumni there 3 times over. First time, I was a Bachelor of Science in Physics with distinction. In that, I picked up lots of computer science electives, worked as a computer science tutor within the department. I graduated, changed departments, went over to the computer science department to study my honours degree, and then moved into a Doctor of Philosophy program where I studied neural networks, in particular Cohen-style self-organising feature maps. So that led me to 2001. In 2001, I did what graduates do. I wrote my resume up, submitted it to a bunch of companies, went and did job interviews, and eventually secured a job with a company called Calatrix Technologies. They were a small startup developing products for enterprise systems, looking at integrating large businesses with other large businesses. At the time, Corba and J2EE were just starting to becoming really big players, and we thought we might have a technological solution that would fit that space. We found, however, that was a hard space to get into, and we accidentally stumbled into defence contracting. Because they had a lot of the same problems as large enterprise organisations, but didn't have the profile and standardised technologies like Corba and J2EE. Now, unfortunately, I joined Calatrix Technologies about 3 months after they got their first round funding, and about 2 months after the dot-com crash. So at one point, having joined a company that was originally, I was employee 13, I got down to employee 1 of 4, 2 of whom were the founders. And so that meant we had to focus very hard on what we were doing and focus on building customers and actual products that people were going to pay, money for. And I spent some time in the United States helping to establish a US office for the company. Good news is that Calatrix survived, and it's now a very profitable multinational defence consulting company. It punches way above its weight. It's for its size, it's a very, very high-profile company. It has companies like Thales and Kellogg Brown Root and Halliburton as customers, and in some cases bids on contracts with those multinational companies and beats them. But software companies change over time, particularly startups. They grow, they get larger. And I started looking for a new challenge, and in 2007, I joined a company called What News as a senior R&D software engineer. What News was a company that was trying to solve the problem of finding news that was relevant to you. So it would browse or would read RSS feeds and new company newsletters and any source of online information it could find about companies and process it, filter it, tag it, identify the people, the companies, the trends, the products that were being spoken about, and would put that into a great big index that you could search and that you could then go and build your customized news feed and say, okay, I want to find all the news where this person is mentioned on the same article as this company. The intention was to sell that as a product that could be used by marketing people to find everywhere that their press release was mentioned, or as a sales lead so that you could go and find where a company was expanding, and maybe if you were selling office furniture, they could go and you could use them as a channel for finding out where you could go and approach people for sales. Unfortunately, what we discovered was that media companies don't like you playing on their turf, so we ended up being sued by pretty much every media company that exists because they don't like you helping them. So we got shut down. They eventually decided they were going to pivot and change What News from being a media company looking at business news to a media company looking at music and the media. So the company changed its name to We Are Hunted. So instead of looking at the newspapers, RSS feeds, or the press releases coming from a company's official channels, we now started looking at the RSS feed and the news being published by Rolling Stone magazine and what the bloggers are talking about in terms of this week's cool new band. And We Are Hunted is now a very, very, very profitable and viable company looking at the problem of how do you find the cool music that's out there. So if you go to We Are Hunted, what you essentially find is a chart of the top 99 songs that the internet was talking about yesterday. And the interesting thing about that market is that the people who write and blog about music are very enthusiastic about music, and they will often be talking about bands that won't be popular on mainstream radio for another 3 to 6 months. So you can find out about all the interesting trends and interesting music that's coming up. I'm now, after a couple of years, I left Hunted and started my own company. I'm now the Chief Technical Officer of a startup called TradesCloud. We are a software as a service company, so we are a web service that is used by plumbers and electricians to organise their day. In particular, plumbers and electricians that have large contracts with property management companies. So, for example, a large real estate agent who has a lot of rental properties will have a standing contract with a particular plumber, and they've got a standard price list and a standard way of saying, we need you to go to this house and fix the sink. We help manage that process. We help you work out what work needs to be done, where it needs to be done, manage the process of telling one particular tradesperson they need to go to this site. When they're on site, they can use their mobile to say, I've done the job, which then triggers the process of sending the invoice to whoever it needs to go to. So that's a summary of my career. I got my first job in a very traditional fashion, but the thing that's interesting is that we started in a very conservative military space. There's a running joke in military circles that the Army's perfect idea, the Army's idea of the perfect technological advancement is a self-sharpening pencil. So they weren't too keen on having all this new technology, but we managed to show them that it was useful. And I went from that military environment to very, very different space into dealing with, rock stars and plumbers and electricians. Now, the thing that's interesting is that other than my very first job, the job that I got straight out of university, every job that I've had since, I haven't had to apply for. I was actively headhunted for my second job. And I'm now in a position where I'm able to start my own company based upon what I know and what I've learned. So how did that happen? Well, this is where the career advice portion starts. I've got a sort of a two-part pitch. Does anyone recognise this screenshot? I see where that comes from. It's a movie from 1967. It's Dustin Hoffman on the left, which is his very first starring role. The movie's called The Graduate. The Graduate, as in the person who has just finished their degree and gone out, a graduate. Yeah. And you may know it. It's famous because the soundtrack was entirely written by Garfunkel, Simon and Garfunkel. So Simon and Garfunkel. So Mrs. Robinson, here's to you, Mrs. Robinson, is from this movie. And there's a scene in this movie where the learned business executive comes to talk to the young graduate and gives him his career advice. And he says, I've got just one word for you, son, plastics. Well, my word for you is Django. How many people in this room have heard of Django? Oh, okay, that's good. How many of you have used it at all? Okay, used it, yeah. Regular users or just, regular use, yeah, okay. All right, so I've been a core developer on the Django project since 2006, which was about a year before I left Calatrix and joined What News. Prior to that point, I had almost no experience in dealing with the web, dealing with internet stuff. The career that I had built at Calatrix was around enterprise type business-to-business systems. But towards the end of my career at Calatrix, we through a series of well-aligned events, we worked out that we could do a lot of what we were doing using web servers and using web technology. And I got very deeply involved in Django as a result. And as a result of being deeply involved in Django, I was actively recruited to go and work at What News. And I'm currently, having started in 2006 on the Django project, I'm now currently the president of the Django Software Foundation, which is the not-for-profit organisation that holds the legal arm of the Django project. So, for those who don't know what Django is a high-level Python web framework that encourages rapid development and clean, pragmatic design. What does that mean? Well, it's a high-level Python web framework. That means it abstracts away the common tasks of building a website or building a database-backed website. It encourages rapid development, so it's there to help you build these websites quickly. One of the sort of a really good example of this is the Django came from a small newspaper in Kansas, and they had it so that they could build these database-backed websites quickly. The manager of the web team came into the web team one day and said, "My son is starting baseball little league this weekend. It would be great if his baseball team had a website so that we could see when the fixtures were and put up photos." And in 2 days, they managed to turn out not just a website for his son's team, but a website for the entire league that tracked where the fixtures were and photos of the teams and comments and scores and tracking batting averages that was arguably better than the National Baseball League's website at the time. And it encourages clean, pragmatic design. So Django has a very strong internal structure that hopefully makes it easy, or we think makes it very, very easy to modify, very, very easy to see what's going on. And it encourages you to do things the right way. There's a list called the OWASP Top 10. It's a list of the top 10 web security problems that exist on websites. The top 10 list is almost impossible to get stuck on. It's almost impossible to have a website that exposes any of these issues if you're using Django, as opposed to something like PHP, where even if you follow the tutorials, you will quite often fall foul of some of these problems. We sometimes refer to it as the web framework for perfectionists with deadlines, as a sort of ultimate sales pitch. Django is in very wide use. It's used on all 7 continents, including the US Antarctic base. It's used by 3 space agencies, NASA, the European Space Agency, and the Russian Space Agency. It's used by hundreds of newspapers. Obviously, it came originally from the Lawrence Journal World, but it has been used at the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, and even won a Pulitzer Prize in 2009. So with some very, very serious projects. The Pulitzer Prize was won for a site called PolitiFact, which is essentially every time a politician says something in public in the United States, PolitiFact takes that phrase and evaluates it. Have they actually told the truth? Is it completely true? Is it maybe true? Or is it a complete lie? And you'll see we've got down on the bottom right there, promises he's rated recently on Obama, support airline service in small towns. Well, that's probably true. End income tax for seniors making less than $50,000. Ooh, no, that one's completely wrong. So they're trying to keep politicians in check so they can't just make arbitrary statements and hope the media prints them without ever checking them. But it's not just for media organisations, not just for news organisations. You've probably heard of some of these companies: Instagram, Mozilla, Disqus, Pinterest. They're all Django sites, or they're all significantly Django sites. Instagram was recently valued for $1 billion. Pinterest last week raised a round of funding based on a $2.5 billion valuation. Both of them are Django sites entirely. Mozilla is slowly transitioning all of their infrastructure over to Django. Now, Django is not the only product in this space. There are other products that are in a similar sort of territory, and it's not even the only one in Python. So Ruby on Rails is a very similar sort of project using Ruby as a language. Pyramid is an alternate framework in Python. But Django, of course, is the very best of them all, so just completely objectively. I tell you, I have the utmost respect for all of these people. They are all very good frameworks with various strengths and weaknesses. If you want to know more, djangoproject.org. It's free to download, it's free to use, and the tutorial will get you from having never built a website before to a functioning website where you're able to do an online poll. Okay, so that's me selling Django, but Django by itself is not going to help you with your career. So how does Django and fit into this whole picture? Well, the real word that I want to take away is not plastics and not Django, but open source. How many of you have heard of open source? Yeah, most of you, okay. How many of you use open source code regularly? Okay. How many of you have contributed to an open source project? Oh, very good. How many of you would count yourself as being a major contributor or part of the core team of a Django project, of an open source project? No? Okay. Yeah, that's anyway. Okay, for those who didn't put their hand up and know the term, open source is a philosophy about how you develop software and how you distribute software. The traditional model is proprietary software, where a company builds a software product, compiles it up, puts it into a binary, sells it for a large amount of money, and if there's a bug, then the customer has to hope the bug gets fixed, because all they've got is the end product, the end binary. Open source says you might give the customer an end binary, but you also give them the source code, all of the tools that they need to fix the problem if they needed to. And you release it to them in such a way under licensing terms that say, if you fix that bug, we'd like you to give that fix back to us so that we can then share that with everyone else. So the idea is that instead of saying we are the people who control everything, it's all our code and it's our secrets, precious, precious, you say, okay, here is the source code and we'll all benefit, everyone will benefit if everyone contributes. So, okay, why does that have anything to do with career advice? Well, okay, you're all university students. You will be at some point in the inevitable future graduating. I'm going to break some very shocking news to you. The list of things you don't know about software development at this point would neatly fit into the Grand Canyon. You have, I am sure, an excellent theoretical technical education. But, and that education will have taught you all sorts of very useful fundamental skills. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of things you haven't done yet. How many of people in this room know what unit testing is and have actively used a unit testing suite or done test-driven development? Okay. How many of you, integration test suites, how many of you have used an integration test suite? Okay. How many of you have participated in an open code review process? Okay. How many of you have used a code review tool? Yeah? Version control? Used a version control tool? Distributed version control? Yes, okay. The people who have contributed to open source projects know this stuff. Okay, all of these things, if you don't know what these are yet, you're going to go into your job on the first day and they're going to say, hi, here's a bug tracking system, here's a version control system, here's a source code review tool. Use them, because if you don't, you're going to leave. And the reason is not because they want to make your life hard, it's because they want to make your life easier. These are things that you cannot live without in real-world software engineering. So the thing is, in theory, which is what you've been doing at university, there's no difference between theory and practice. You've done lots and lots of theoretical computer science, lots of theoretical project management. In theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. And the only way that you get experience doing this stuff is by actually doing it. The only way you get good at software development is by developing software. The only way you get good at writing is by writing. The traditional approach to this is to go off and be a graduate hire. Get your resume, send it in, hope someone gives you an interview, do well at the interview, go on and discover on day one that you know nothing and hope and then you learn fast enough they don't fire you. Open source can give you that experience for free. Okay? You can short-circuit that whole process of learning about how software engineering works in the real world for free. I'm part of the Django core team. This photo is from DjangoCon 2008, which was the very, very first Django conference. It was at the Googleplex in Mountain View. What does being the core developer mean? It doesn't mean I wrote all the code. Okay? I wrote a lot of code, but I certainly haven't written all the code that is in Django. Okay? I have had to read a lot of other people's code. It means I have to review a lot of other people's code. It means I have to act as a gateway between the wider community and the core team and the source code repository that we use. I have to use version control and bug tracking systems and code review systems. I spend a lot of time on mailing lists and IRC channels answering questions from everyone from new users of the system through to experienced developers who want to contribute themselves. I have to help manage and direct the efforts of other volunteers that are involved in the project. Okay, so what? Do any of these things sound like skills an employer might be interested in? I'll save you the suspense. The answer is yes. Remember how I said I was headhunted? Django, open source, is the reason why. Okay? I have now got, in public, logged, where other people can see it, 8 years of experience of what my software engineering skills are like. Okay? If you want to know what I'm like when I communicate with customers, you can see thousands of examples of my correspondence. If you want to see what my code review skills are like, you can see hundreds of code reviews that I've done. If you want to see what my usage of bug tracking systems is like, you can see thousands of bugs that I've addressed. When you go into your first job, or you start sending out your resumes to get your first job, you are essentially one sheet of paper in a stack of thousands of other sheets of paper. The most important thing you can do is stand out. And sadly, as someone who has been on the other side of the hiring process, standing out can quite often mean knowing how to use a spell checker. But even better than that is to be able to say, I've got experience, I've been doing this. Look over here and you can see the code that I've been writing. And it's not just my toy projects. This is stuff that guys with 20 years of experience has been reviewing and saying is good. I'm not just a graduate with a degree. I'm a graduate with a degree and several years of practical experience writing software in a semi-professional context or in an equivalent to professional context. And if you're really good, if you're someone who has been actively participating in open source, you don't need to send in your resume. You will be actively hunted down because you are the 18, 19, 20-year-old who has been contributing in open source. There's another member of the Django core team, his name is Alex Gaynor, and he is mind-numbingly intelligent. He will never have to send in an application for a job in his life because for 3 years before he graduated university, he was submitting patches to Django. So the reason Django can support multiple databases at the same time is largely due to a patch that he submitted, amongst many thousands of other things that he's done in open source. So if you can build a reputation for yourself by contributing to open source, you may not even need to look for a job. Jobs will come looking for you. So, what experience do you get from contributing? Well, you can write code. Okay, obviously you're in an open source project. You get to write code. You get to review. You get to write code. And when you write code for the first time, I'll let you know your code is going to be ridiculed. Okay, because you only get good at writing code through experience. And the more you write, the better you get. The code that I wrote 5 years ago, I look at now and I'm embarrassed at how bad some of that code is. You only get that experience by doing it. And open source gives you a real-world set of problems, not just your homework assignment, toy, let's try and optimize an algorithm problem. Here is a real functioning web server we need to do something with, or here is a real compiler that needs to improve some real-world thing. And that's a much more difficult engineering task than something that's a toy project. And okay, so you're going to get ridiculed, hopefully politely ridiculed, but don't be discouraged. Try again. Open source communities, the good open source communities anyway, don't ever say, don't come back again. They're saying, come back next time with something a little better, please. And they want you to participate. You also, however, in order to be an active member of the community, you don't just write code, you have to review it. Okay? A core part of the Django development process is people looking at other people's code to say, that's bad because this shouldn't be submitted because this thing won't work, or this particular loop will fall into an infinite loop if this condition happens. Being able to spot those problems is a critical skill for professional software engineering, and it's something you only get to do when you have to look at lots and lots of very complicated code. It's not something you can do on toy projects. And it also means you have to then improve your communication skills because you've got to communicate to someone how this problem exists. So you have to deal with customers, you have to deal with co-workers, you have to be able to hold an intelligent design discussion to bring an issue to resolution without devolving into insults. The only way to get good at writing is to write. Now you have, in this room, particularly if you're going to be dealing with open source communities, American open source communities, there is a language barrier as well. The best way to practice your English skills is to write English, lots. Now, okay, some communities don't take this quite as well as others. The number of times that people come onto Django's mailing list and say, I'm sorry for my English, I'm native speaker of Russian, Indian, whatever. I have absolute patience for anyone that is willing to try and speak English on a mailing list, as long as they're actually trying. because your Russian is infinitely better than your English is infinitely better than my Russian. So if you're willing to try, if you're willing to put yourself out there and say, hey, I'm trying to do this thing, this is an idea that I've got, I'm willing to meet you halfway and sort of try and work around the problems or gaps that you might have in communicating. And over time, your English will get better because you'll be reading lots of English, reading lots of technical English, and writing lots of technical English. There's also things that are very, very hard to teach. Taste is one of those things. Have you any of you studied the Gang of Four design patterns? You know about design patterns? You've heard of singletons? You know about the singleton pattern? Okay. Is it a good idea? Is a singleton a good idea? Almost never is the correct answer. These are things you only learn through having written projects that have singletons that are now biting you on the arse. And it's hard to spot them sometimes because you've got to kind of, no, hang on, that's not going to work because in practice we're going to want to do this thing and that's going to be really hard if this happens. There's also, the Django community has a couple of sort of shorthands. One is Yagni and one is Dry. Yagni is Y-A-G-N-I. You ain't going to need it. And Dry is don't repeat yourself. They're principles about this is a great design and look at this wonderful design for how my class structure is going to interface together and oh, look at this. Yeah, okay, that will allow you to arbitrarily model the universe assuming the gravitational constant changes. The gravitational constant's never going to change. That's not flexibility you need in your system. So identifying bad ideas is hard and only comes with experience. It's a bit like good art. It's hard to describe what it is, but most people can tell what good art is and what bad art is if they've had lots of experience. And novices generally aren't good at picking good art and bad art because they haven't seen enough of it. And yes, there's differences. Some people think some things are better art than others, but there's a broad consistency. Leonardo da Vinci, good art. This pile of stuff in the corner, probably not good art. So, okay, how do you get involved? First off, it doesn't matter where you live. I came from Perth, Western Australia, very isolated capital city. I was a core developer on the Django project for 3 years before I met another core developer on the project in person. And one of the other core developers lives in Australia. So you don't need to be physically anywhere. The internet is a wonderful thing. Open source is designed around the principle that you don't know where everyone is. The communications all happen in the open and documented, the design decisions are documented and designed around the idea that you're not going to have everyone in a room pointing at a whiteboard. So, what is important? Well, you need to pick a project. Now, obviously, pick Django, pick Django. But, no, seriously, pick any project. Pick something that is interesting to you. If you are interested in compilers, go join Rolgo in the PyPy project. If you are interested in web technologies, come join Django. If you're interested in databases, go join the PostgreSQL project. Pick something that seems to have a culture, read their mailing list, pick something that seems to have a culture you enjoy, that a piece of technology that's in a level of maturity that you want to participate in. And pick something that you think, has legs in terms of long-term technology. You're essentially picking where you'd like your career to go. Pick something that is representative of what you'd like your career to look like. The only advice I'd give you here is resist the temptation to start your own project. Open source makes it very, very easy for you to start your own project from scratch. But if you do that, you're going to miss out on all the benefits of dealing with other people's code and dealing with large experienced software engineering people in the industry. So you've picked your tool, learn how to use it. Don't just start contributing patches for something that you don't know how to use yet. Actually actively use your tool of choice and find out where the pressure points are. What is it good at? What is it bad at? Where does it fall over? Where has it got bugs? Just like, running your own project is a bad idea, jumping in and offering to help when you don't know the tool you're helping is also a bad idea. Learn about the community. Find out how the community operates. How do they track bugs? And what's their convention? What conventions exist for their version control systems? How do they format their code? Do they have any conventions there? Where do the new people in the community go for help? Where does the design discussions happen? Lurk for a little bit. Hang around before you actively get involved. Now, good projects will have documented all of these conventions. And there'll be if you go to the Django project, I can point you with a document that says, you're new to the community, here's the instructions for how to contribute for the first time. And if the conventions don't exist somewhere in a written down form and you're still interested in the project, there's task number 1. offer to document their conventions for contributing so that then you can collaborate the experience, write some documentation for someone, and make a meaningful contribution to the project. That, in this case, isn't code. Be aware of culture and tone. Every community is different. Get to understand the community norms before you start. In particular, you are going to be particularly prone to this because you are English as a second language. So if you're participating in an English language forum, you need to be aware that certain ways of using language can appear very confrontational. There is a big difference between saying, I think Django should do this way, and saying, is there any reason that Django doesn't do this in this particular way? One sounds like an accusation that this isn't the right way to do it, and the other is an open inquiry to say, is there a reason why this isn't being done? And as a result, sometimes you're going to get, this is where miscommunications come from. It may be the best of intention question that you think something should be done this way, but what you really want to do is engage the community and engage on that cultural basis. You've also got to remember that everyone else in this community, on most open source projects, are volunteers. They're not paid to answer your questions. So you are somewhat relying upon them hoping that you're then going to become an active part of the community. If the first thing you do is insult them, that's not a great way to sort of start the relationship. Start small. Try help out in little ways. If you want to write code, fix a small problem. Try answering the questions of newcomers. It's a great way to practice your written communication skills, and it's also a very visible contribution. When people join the Django project by starting to answer questions on the mailing list, I notice. I read every message, I scan every message that goes through the Django users mailing list, and when someone starts answering a lot of user questions, I notice their name because they're doing something that I no longer have to do, and I like those people. Try fixing a small bug. Don't try and fix the monumental architectural issue. Fix the little problem. Fix the encoding issue that only happens when you use Russian as your chosen language. Fix the problem that only happens every second Tuesday that's annoying but not quite big enough that everyone's really got around to it. Now, the thing to remember is that open source communities operate on trust. Okay? Broadly speaking, open source operates on very democratic and meritocratic ideas, or at least they aspire to. Whether they do or not varies from project to project. But as a matter of practicality, some people have to be ignored. Okay? I can't evaluate every patch that is submitted to Django. It's just physically not possible. There aren't enough hours in the day, even if I were being paid to do it. So you have to build trust. It sometimes means you're going to do something without feedback for a little while, and then someone will notice that you're making lots of contributions and look at all those contributions in bulk. Or they'll say, hang on, you've just proposed to have fixed a whole bunch of bugs in this particular area. That makes a bit of a sweet spot. I'm going to go review all those bugs. You need to build trust so that I know that I can trust you, and that means that I'm not going to be wasting my time if I help you. Okay, so you need to build those trust mechanisms rather than just sort of assuming that everyone's going to run to your aid. If you do have to jump in and do something large, then do your background research. Demonstrate you understand the problem you're trying to solve. Implementation always trumps an idle discussion. So if you can see that this is a good idea, actually writing some prototype code to prove your point is a great way of proving your point. What you're looking to do here is maximize utility. I have limited hours in the day. I'm looking to spend those hours as effectively as possible. If you can make it to the point where all I need to go is say, yes, then you've just made my day a lot easier. If I have to sit down and review every line of code and find the discussion you were talking about, it's just too much effort. I'm going to go and do something else. So try and make my life as easy as possible, and I'll do as much as I can to make your life easy as possible. Also, do the hard stuff, do the unglamorous stuff. Everyone wants to fix the high-profile bug. No one ever wants to do the dirty work, like triage the bugs that have just been reported to the bug tracking system, writing and editing documentation, answering the dumb questions on mailing lists. A good example of something that's very, very laborious but incredibly useful. You are all, not English speakers naturally, but you do speak Russian. Django's documentation is not currently available in Russian. Hey, there's a task you can do. And it'd be very useful. The whole Russian community would benefit from having a Russian translation of the documentation. There's something you could do. And not necessarily for Django, but you could do it for other projects as well. And scale up over time. You start small. Over time, you'll develop trust in the community, and then you end up with the trust that makes it worthwhile looking at the bigger problems. So what's the catch? the catch is you need to put in effort. It's volunteerism, okay? You need to put time in, you need to spend the time. Sometimes that time, at least initially, may appear to be a little bit futile. But if you persist, you keep trying, you take on the advice that you're given when you're given advice, if you try to align yourself with the project as much as possible, after a relatively short period of time, you may find yourself in a position where you are a core developer on an open source project. And all of a sudden, you don't have to worry about looking for jobs anymore. And even if you don't get to be the core developer, you can still say, I am a major contributor to this project as line number 1 on your resume, which is, I'll tell you the honest truth, a lot more impressive than 95% on any degree program from any university in the world. So what have you got to lose? Absolutely nothing. Okay? Open source has done wonders for my career. The only thing you've got to risk is a little bit of your spare time. And what else are you going to do? You know, play video games? You know, just watch TV? Well, you know. So, have fun. Yep. Oh. Did you want to do Holger?
Or we can listen to Holger now and then have a short discussion about it.
Yep.
Will you stand or do you want to walk with the microphone?
Well, I don't have slides, so actually it's a good idea to be a bit dynamic. So I think Russell actually gave you a lot of very good advice already, and I'm trying to complement that. So a bit of my background. I started with programming in 1986 or 1985. I'm that old. And I started with Commodore and Sinclair ZX81 and things like this. You might find those computers in museums. And I actually got to use it, and one of my activities that I had with school friends was actually sitting down, meeting up in the afternoon, and there were computer magazines where there were lots of numbers on pages, right? And these numbers on the pages we had to type in. So one of us actually was telling the numbers, and the other was typing in the numbers. There was like a checksumming approach, so it wasn't so easy to make mistakes. And after about 1 hour, we had entered all of the numbers, and then we could play a game. Because that was actually the way how games were published at that time, as a printed list of numbers on a computer magazine, right? So and then we, of course, started to wonder, what do these numbers mean, actually? Why do these numbers actually represent a game? And we started, of course, to want to tweak that. Like, we wanted to change the game, because we didn't like how a certain thing was done. And so we went ahead. And at the time, what we needed to do is, we needed to learn assembler, machine code. And there were no tools. So we didn't have access to any kind of tools how we can actually we had to actually write down numbers. So one of the first things we did is we wrote a little kind of like, or we searched for tools that allowed us to write like assembler in like, you know, i86, what you know, and some others maybe, and translate this down to numbers. So we created a higher level language to create those numbers, which was assembler, right? And we got quite good at it, because we invested a lot of time actually in doing that. And then when I was like 14 or 15 or so, I was hired by a gaming company. And I earned at that time something like, besides school, in the age of 15, I earned something like 2,000 German marks per month, which was like 1,000 euros in like 1986. It was a lot of money at that time. So I couldn't buy a car, I wasn't living in the US, but I was having a good time, right? And I usually worked until, I don't know, 3 o'clock in the night, then went to school to like, you know, just got around the school there, and you know, it's all boring anyway, and then went back to computer programming, worked for Electronic Arts and other things like this. At some point I decided, this is all fine, I mean, this went on for a couple of years, and then I decided, I actually want to understand what's the theory behind this, right? that was my motivation to actually start studying computer science. So I started computer science in 1991 or 2 and studied that for a couple of years. And of course, all the programming tasks and things and the languages that I learned, they weren't really interesting to me. I've built already much larger systems than what were tasked in the university. So that wasn't interesting. I only went to the mathematics and theory of computer science stuff, Turing machines and all of this. I found this highly interesting because it actually gave me the theory of what I was doing there. Now, after that, or during university already, I started consulting. So I was already doing C and C++ and some other things. And I started consulting and earning lots of money for a couple of years. That was like the end of, so I finished my degree and I went to like consult for Volkswagen and the second largest German bank and things like this. And I don't want to scare you or so, but I was earning tons of money actually. That was all fine and dandy, but one thing I really disliked about the situation, which was that I increasingly found out that what was going on at those companies I was working for, not only Volkswagen, not only that bank, they spent like millions and hundreds of millions on software projects. It was like the big age of automizing everything, and banks had to do that, of course. And I found out that the level of expertise, I was using Linux already, right? Like from 1991 or something like this. I was using Linux and like kind of like open source systems at the time already. And I found out that the level of expertise of software development in those commercial companies where they have hundreds of millions of euros being spent on software development was a far cry from what the open source community was doing at the time. So even though I worked with people, like 60 people in a project, who each earned something like 10,000 euro a month, like high-level experts, right? I went basically to the open source community like in 98, 99, and found out there were people communicating with me, answering questions, and they really knew what they were talking about. They had like far more expertise than these 10,000 euro experts per month, right? And I decided something is wrong here. You know, there's a couple of people actually doing stuff like Linux and working on web browsers and server technology and all kinds of stuff, the same things that happens in commercial development, but there's like an increasing number of people being involved in open source development, and they are much more an expert than their commercial counterparts. And of course, it's not only black and white. I mean, there were, of course, a few people actually in the companies who were also connected to these open source communities. But I can tell you what happened in the next years. I decided that, like it's a long story, but I decided eventually to dive much more into the open source community. So I left this kind of consulting stuff. I had like a money buffer, and eventually I wrote like a new distributed system with Corba and some stuff, C++, but then I discovered Python for several reasons. And I liked that language very much. And I dived into that community, and in 2003 I founded the PyPy project, which is again dates back to my experiences as a 14-year-old doing compilers with like writing a language that gets translated to a lower level. In this case, of course, Python is a much higher level language than assembler, but the idea was the same. Like I wanted to actually work on the inner workings of how computer languages work and improve that. So the reason I actually did that was because I had established contact through one of the first Python conferences with basically what I consider world-leading experts in compiler technology. I just met them like at an open source conference, right? I'm talking, for example, about, I'm not sure if you've heard of them, of him, for example, about Armin Rigo, like a PhD from Switzerland. He has done many, many important projects, and many other computer languages programmers, they're actually envious of the Python community having someone like him actually working on things. So I got to know him, and we founded that new compiler project. And I can tell you that by 2013, I would say, like from all of I've been to like 25 conferences, talked in many occasions, and did many projects beside this PyPy one, that the world's best software engineers, they're all involved in open source. Be they at commercial companies like Intel, Oracle even, or Microsoft, or Canonical, doing Ubuntu, and so on. The world's best software engineers are all connected to open source development in 2013. You're not going to, if you go to any kind of company, like I consulted 2 years ago, I consulted the German Soccer Association on their software. And it was about open sourcing some of their systems that they're using to organize the whole of the German soccer organization. And, well, we discovered that actually their code base was already 99% open source. Because all of the companies, including them, actually are using open source in basically every layer of what they are offering. If you go to any larger software company running a web service, like be it on Amazon's cloud or wherever, you're going to find that the absolute majority of the code they're actually running is all open source. It is the dominant collaboration model between companies today. So companies are actually collaborating through open source. It means they're sharing infrastructure like JVMs, all kinds of computer languages, databases, kernels, like starting from Android. Linux is very popular on servers, you know that probably. It's all open source. And there's many people in many companies actually contributing to open source. There's, of course, even more individuals, because if you are in open source, you're actually an individual. You are currently working at a company somewhere, like at Intel. But in 3 years on, you might be working somewhere else. Your relations you build in the open source community, they will stick. They will last across your company involvements. So if you actually start building relations in the open source community, they're going to last for a very long time. And you're going to have contact to those people. They know what you're doing. And when you actually are looking for a job, and you tell those people after a couple of years, it's going to be much easier, because many people already know you, and they know what you've done, and you will have a very easy entrance into new opportunities. So open source is the collaboration model, and it has basically all relevant technologies, or not all, but most of the current technologies are open source based, even if they have their own proprietary stack on top of that. They still rely on a large stack of stuff that is open source. And if you want to get to know the most interesting current technical developments in the software world, just look at the many, many open source projects and what they are actually doing. Like, you probably know GitHub. Who of you knows GitHub? Right? It has literally millions of projects that are currently being worked on. Like, if you look into new programming languages, like Rust, or the new one that's currently developed from Mozilla, or Golang from Google, they kind of like try to raise what you can do with computer languages today. They are all developed as open source. It's a free mailing list. If you are interested in that, you can go there. If you want to know how you can massively scale out to millions of users, your databases and your web servers, they're all open source projects. It's all done in the open. You can just look there. If you want to know how good user interfaces are done, there's like open courses on that. There's lots of things how you can actually design your web applications using Django or whatever, or the newest CSS technologies, how you can actually write your in a particular language, your styling of web pages and things like this, and all of this, each of these developments is done in an open style manner, right? I mean, even Microsoft is participating in that. So it's really, if you want to actually get into interesting stuff that happens in any of these areas, just go and look around what kind of projects there already are, and start reading. Russell gave very good advice on what that means actually, how to get involved. But I just want to add that it's really worthwhile. You're going to learn a lot about technology, about interesting stuff that interests you, right? And it's very likely that you actually, end up doing something that you like. I know a number of friends who also studied computer science, and they kind of like went the traditional way. They just used their academic degree to get a job. And most of them, over time, actually succeeded. But many of them became unhappy because they had to do things they didn't actually like. So there's not only the money issue, there's not only the thing, how do I get a good job in terms of like, getting great money, but I hope you also have an interest to have some kind of a happy life where you actually do something that you find interesting. It can also mean managing teams, but managing teams and having like team collaboration and things like this, you also have to kind of like learn that. And there's really many opportunities, and I actually hope, and I don't really know why this doesn't happen more, but I actually hope that universities learn to connect better to all of these open source activities, because there's tons of possibilities how you can actually contribute from the university, from courses you do here, to open source projects. There is no need to have a separation. I mean, universities, at least in Germany, they have a public task, which is basically education, but also doing something good for society. And I think like starting to have courses that actually interact, or you probably have that sometimes, I think, but increasing that, actually having courses that allow you to contribute as a task in your university degree to connect and contribute to open source would be, I think, a very good match. And universities in Germany are starting to do that. I mean, since a couple of years, but it's increasing. So they actually say, for example, not only in computer technology, they say as a course content, we are going to fix a number of articles in Wikipedia, which are not very good. You can do that in history and so on. And you learn to interact with other people, and you're actually doing something very useful to others and to society. So these kind of like, there's a general, more general even than open source thought behind this, which is sharing. Like sharing what you do and actually using what others do. And it's one thing actually where things are, the reason why things are happening so well and so many IT companies are so successful in the US and in Europe is, in my opinion, because they have developed over time a very good culture of this kind of sharing. Because even if I do something, I have a lot of competitors. When I do a project, I have competition. But that doesn't mean that we cannot collaborate on some aspects, because we share a certain interest, and we can actually, usually I manage to actually get some kind of collaboration, even in a competitive situation. So, I mean, it's obviously there's lots of areas I'm covering here, but I just want to say that do try to actually enter one of these sharing cultures and work there and find the area you are interested in. And try to get a foothold in communication to people, and if you can attend meetings or conferences, it's going to be much easier because you meet people in person and can have a beer over questions. And that's also a very useful thing to have, and you make connections where you actually can find also jobs or other interesting projects to do. So with that, I actually want to leave it, because I think it's a good idea to enter some kind of dynamic discussion and comments and have a joint discussion about what that means and where the problems are, or why do you think it's a totally bad idea? I rather want to just sit in my room and do my thing. Leave me alone. Okay, thank you.
Значит, если кто-то стесняется задать вопросы по-английски, можете по-русски говорить, я буду переводить. Но важно понимать ответ. Вопрос, а потом тоже
What about user system for Django? Why it's so not custom? Why it's so hard to customize it?
Customize what?
Why is it hard to customize the user model in Django? Yes. Have you looked at what's in Django 1.5 coming out any day now? You looked at the release candidate was released Tuesday last week. Yeah, we fixed that problem.
You're too late.
Yes. So yeah, no, in Django 1.5, one of the major features we've added is the ability to specify a custom user model that has whatever properties you want. The only restriction is that you need to have a unique identifying field of some kind. Beyond that, you can have whatever additional fields you want. And any existing projects will need to be lightly adapted, but you'll get plenty of warnings about the fact what it needs to be adapted. So there will be a process, existing third-party plugin applications won't be compatible with that system yet, but they can be fixed very, very easily. And that's, again, is an area where you could contribute as a third-party contributor to an open source project. All right?
Russell.
Yes.
We published one of our internal projects on the open source scenes some times ago, but it's not so famous. I try to speak about this project on different conferences to invite people to participate in this project, but I have no success. And this project still driven only by my colleagues and me. This is difficult to invite new people to the project.
Sure, it is. And there's sort of two answers to that question. The first is, or sort of that sort of inquiry. The first is, why does it matter? If it's open sourced and it's working for you and it's doing what you need it to do, then who cares? The worst thing that's happened is that your code is available for someone else to see. So you've got all the same engineering benefits you would have had if it was closed source. It's just the opportunity exists for other people to contribute, they just haven't taken you up on it. It doesn't affect your ability to use the code at all. Obviously, you would like it to become a community as large and as vibrant as Django's, because then it means you get increased benefits, and you'd like to see those sorts of benefits. So essentially that falls down to really being a marketing exercise. It's got very little to do with software engineering and a lot more to do with getting the word out. The most effective way, and the way that Django effectively did this, the way that Rails did it, the way that most open source projects do it, that have the really big Nessun Dorma moment, is essentially a really, really compelling tech demo. In the case of Django, it was building a blog in 5 minutes. In the case of Rails, it was building a wiki in 10 minutes. In the case of Meteor, it was, here is a live interactive demo by which you can have an offline mobile application communicating with things on the server, and hey, look, they update at the same time. I don't know what your project is, but you need to find a way to capture why is it awesome in 5 minutes or less, and publish that. Don't worry about the technical details. Don't worry about how don't worry about the technical details and how structurally advanced it is. Find that one thing that you can use to tell people it's awesome. It really is. Come and help us.
I'd like to add something, because I think it's a very, very important point that you are likely to encounter if you enter, I say, the open source culture. When open source became kind of bigger 10 years ago or 12 years ago, it was often the case that you could do something and nobody else had done it yet, because the competition to open source at that time was the big evil Microsoft, right? So if you've, and they are, and that's the evil word, they are proprietary. That means they own the code, they control everything, you don't get to change anything, and if something doesn't work for you, bad luck. You might pay them and maybe they fix it. So many people didn't like that, so they developed, not only in 2000, but that was when it was getting bigger, they developed an open source alternative, and even if it was in functionality, it was worse, people liked it because they could use and improve it for their own purposes, free of licensing fees and free of control from Microsoft. That was the situation in 2000. Now it's like 13 years later, and you have multiple million existing open source projects, right? The situation is very different. If you go out now and publish your open source project, even if it's very good, and I've seen some very good stuff, chances are nobody's going to pay much attention. And I'm not saying it's a good thing. It's just, that's a bit of a problem, right? And I can give you my current view because I also have this problem and I'm doing something new. I need to think about how can I actually frame it such that people are interested. One thing that is very helpful is if you have actually established relations with open source projects. The way, for example, I mean, Russell is of course a big example of having like, you know, being the president of a software foundation and having done lots of contributions, me maybe as well. But even if you just have, on a lower level, have contributed and have made your relations, this is actually your initial audience. They know what you're doing. If you start a new project because you've figured out something is missing there, this database driver doesn't do what it do, this user interface thing doesn't do what it actually could do in terms of this networking library is much more efficient in certain ways. If you actually have relations to multiple other people, the more the better, that listen to you, that give you their attention when you say, I have a new thing, right? It makes it much more likely that you can establish a new project. So I would say, I mean, just think about it. If we have like a certain software code base that we worked on now, like with great algorithms, like say a mesh network that connects all of our smartphones into a dynamic network and allows us to operate without a carrier network, just directly. There are some projects like this ongoing, right? If you now think that one of you actually goes out and says, I've done this project, or if I go out, or Russell goes out and says, I've done that project. You know, you have a very different audience, but you build this kind of audience, you build this kind of relations. That's just my current view. So it's a problem if you're doing even something very good to find an audience that listens to you. And before you actually do something brilliant, it's actually a very good idea to first, like Russell said in his talk, try to establish relations to people that actually listen to you. So when you publish something, then people actually pay attention. The second thing there is, of course, if it's super brilliant, like super, hyper, duper brilliant, right? Then you might have a chance just going out and say, here's it, right? But I haven't managed to do something like that, right? Russell hasn't managed to do something like that. I mean, yes, I try to, of course. I mean, we all try to like do the thing, right? But that's a running gag actually in open source. If you ask an open source developer, at least in like later years, I think it's still a running gag. If you ask an open source developer, so what is your idea with doing that project? The eventual answer is world domination. So, okay, so the short advice is try to build relations. Try to get audiences that listen to you before you actually try to do something. And chances are that you actually have a much better idea, because you also listen to people. You have a much better idea of what is actually something that interests people. You know? So, I mean, that's a bit of a long answer, not only to you, but it's really a problem. And it's also a problem for me. It's like, it's a very, there's so many good projects, it's not funny.
It's your first visit to Russia.
This is my first visit to Russia, yes.
Mine as well.
What is
Oh, this. Oh, okay. This is my travel buddy. I started going. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Yes, it's my first visit to Russia, and this is my travel buddy. His name is B2. He's a character from a Australian children's television show called Bananas in Pyjamas. They're coming down the stairs. They're coming down in pairs. Anyway, so I started going to conferences, 15 years ago, and I usually was going to conferences either by myself or at the company's expense. And my first conference I went out on was by myself and had a brand spanking new $1,500 1 megapixel digital camera that I didn't really want to put in the hands of a random stranger so they could take a photo of me in front of the Washington Monument or wherever I was. So I take my little buddy along and I go and put him in front of whatever I'm taking a photo of. I step back, take a photo, pick him up and walk on. With the exception of, you can't really put it in front of, people's tombs and things like that without it being too crass. So other than that, it's just a great little way for me I was here without actually having to be in the photo myself. It's also a great way to meet people because you usually get people asking questions, what's that weird thing in your pocket? So it's helpful when you're traveling by yourself to meet people. So. And yes, so no, not only is it my first trip to Russia, this is my first time ever seeing snow. So, yes, it's cold, I noticed. Sorry, there's a question?
Yes, long question. Your first job at Callitrix, right? Did you use open source software, for example, you work on military contracts?
Okay, when I very, very first started, generally not. It was a Java stack that we were working with, and we were dealing with Corba, primarily Corba, which is an object request broker. Technology's now gone by the wayside, been essentially replaced by REST gateways and things like that. So when we very, very first started, no. But by the time that I'd been there for 3 or 4 years, more and more of what I was doing was open source, to the point where we ended up dealing with a protocol called HLA, which is a thing the military uses, which is the high-level architecture. And there were a number of commercial vendors who sell at exorbitant prices implementations of HLA. And we ended up, inside Callitrix, writing an open source alternative that was better in most ways, faster, easier, and cheaper. So initially the answer was no. We grew and we started using more and more open source as time went by. And part of the reason that I found Django, I started contributing to Django in my spare time, and just by sheer coincidence, we had a project that would also be suited to Django, so I got to work on Django as part of my day job as well. The argument for using open source in those contexts was essentially it wasn't an issue, because what you're saying is, here is something that is free, that is demonstrated elsewhere can work. So it costs nothing to at least try. Most engineering companies can afford to spend a week trying something to see if it works. So in the case of Django, we had this project. We were looking to we were looking at military training exercises and trying to track whether or not people participating in the exercise were meeting their training goals. Now, the original design, we had this idea of what we were going to do. We were going to build this big Java server system and a big user interface that was going to be on people's Palm Pilots and things like that. And I had this epiphany that, hey, aren't we just talking about building a website here? So my engineering manager at the time sort of said, well, yeah, I suppose you're right, so let's have a try. And in the space of a week, we'd nutted out essentially the core of what we thought we were going to have to build, and at a cost that was going to be vastly less than what we thought was going to be if we had to build a full server system. So essentially, I've never had a problem convincing someone that open source is the solution to use, because the only benefit that a commercial product has is to say that it's better, and you've got to kind of take their word for it. You've got to give them $2,000 and then take their word for it. Whereas with open source, it's free. If it works, great. If it doesn't, you can look at another free alternative. And at the end of the day, you know, you're able to make the judgment as to whether it's going to work for you.
Yes, but there's also the trouble that many software companies are facing, particularly the enterprise companies. They have a certain trouble switching to new technologies, and in particular to open source technologies, because it was implemented here. We just used to do it this way, this particular way, and we're not gonna move. So how would you go about persuading someone stuck in a particular rut to change their ways, to move with you?
May I ask back, actually, you said, who exactly is not wanting to use open source stuff?
It's not about not wanting, it's about measuring cost versus the benefits. So if you are working at big enterprise level company that produces enterprise level software, you have a certain stack of technologies, for example, Microsoft stack, yeah, that you are used to deal with, to work with. Many people at your company are great at handling it, but you think you have a better idea, for example, a better ORM framework for dealing with the problem you're currently facing. But you're facing senior executives, senior developers who say, well, that might be okay to use it, but we're gonna stick with commercial solutions because they have tech support, they have...
Right. I mean, that's something, okay, so you're saying, basically, how can I convince people who are convinced that using commercial solution is actually a better idea than an open source solution, right? And it's, I mean, books have been written about this, and like many discussions and things like this. I've actually, I mean, maybe it's just me, but I hardly know companies anymore that debate this question. It doesn't mean that people don't use Oracle. It doesn't mean that people use this SAP, for example, or that they don't use Perforce. Perforce is like a version control system, a commercial one, and so on. Even Linux used it for a time. But I think it's clearly the minority that does this. And I've worked with companies, for example, that discussed, they have Oracle licenses, and they have, their application is running on top of Oracle. And then the question was, why don't we switch to Postgres? You know, because we don't need, we are basically, both Postgres can do exactly the same we do here, but we are saving like 100,000, really 100,000 per year in license fees. And those discussions are not always easy, and they're not always done on technical grounds. The problem is that for a manager, I mean, think about from the perspective from the manager. He does a decision to use something that is supposed to be the market leader, like Oracle, or he uses a certain enterprise system that is being advised. And if he does this decision and the project doesn't work out, or the product hits limits, it's not going to be his fault, right? If he chooses a solution that is not currently thought to be like the dominant market-leading solution, and it doesn't work out, it's his fault, right? And management is very much concerned with that. It's their position. So they rather spend 100,000, and if it doesn't work out, it cannot be their problem, right? So you have these dynamics, but I think that's something that we have to, when it comes to dynamism of software development and companies doing things, I think we basically all have to look, including Germany, have to look at how things develop in the US, because they are leading this development, like Google, Facebook, and so on, right? All the software innovations actually come from, are driven there, which doesn't mean that that's not driven by many, many developers around the world. But when it comes to companies and high-level funding, it's all happening there. And they don't put up these questions. You will not find a recent web startup massively scaling using Oracle or anything like that. It's not going to happen, right? So it might be that you still have companies, and we also have that in Germany, that put up these questions. And it's not going to be, there's not a golden way on actually go around it, right? But market pressure and actually technology pressure will also reach these companies, I can assure you. I mean, this company I was talking about that uses this $100,000 Oracle license is really one that uses Linux, it uses the Apache web server, it uses the Spring persistence network in Java, and all of the stuff. So basically they are already almost completely using open source across the board. The only thing that's left is Oracle. And the developers agreed, yeah, we can exchange it. We can just use Postgres. They didn't yet have their management there. But there's also the pressure that in IT software companies, in companies where things happen in IT departments, engineers have kind of a defining role, because they ultimately know and have to see what works, right? So it's a power shift, and not all companies actually are willing, and all managers are willing to accept that. So it takes some time, right? So in any kind of concrete case, you have to talk to the people and find convincing arguments, but you can do that with the certainty that over time it will get replaced, right? And people will use other things.
I'll add one little bit to that. The other thing that's worth trying is being successful in it. Do it anyway. If you've been told we're going to do this, make this particular technological change, pick something small, and well, do it with open source. Prove that it can be done. And by the way, I did it for free. All it took was, you know, a day of engineering time to tool up this small solution. Oh, and by the way, the alternative was to spend $100,000 on a license for this thing. So you can have it for free and open sourced, or you can have it expensive. And over time, you build up that reputation as being the guy who knows that you can build things very, very cheap, which is, you know, is an argument people like. The other thing to keep in mind is there's plenty of documented evidence where you mentioned that, you know, big enterprise companies like having the official support contract, which they can rely upon. One, you can get those support contracts for open source companies. There are small consultancies that will quite happily, most, like Django, there are a number of companies that will gladly take your money in exchange for saying they will answer your support questions. But quite often you don't need to do that anyway. There's plenty of documented evidence where open source communities answer questions faster and better than paid support contracts do anyway. So you know, if you want the guarantee that you will get an answer, you may need to pay for it. But you can, you know, pay for it on a per hour basis rather than paying the $1,000, you know, multi-$1,000 contract up front. So yes, success is the best revenge. Essentially, it would be my advice. Go and try it. Go prove it can be done, and push that message upstairs rather than, you know, try to convince them to wholeheartedly abandon the Microsoft stack. You know, build by accretion and on little things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What was the hardest problem that you have ever faced while working on an open source project? And on the other hand, what was the most bright and memorable being engaged in such
The last question again?
And what was the most brightest moment while working on the open source?
Okay, so for me, the hardest thing, it's not so much a specific event as more of an ongoing thing, that because you're dealing for the most part with volunteers, everything takes longer than you hope it would. You know, I'm a manager and I'm the controller, a core developer on a major open source project, and I say, hey, this would be a really great idea, and I think it's a really great idea, but unless everyone else is on board, at the same time, it may not necessarily happen. So you're going to say a good example is Django's own webpage. You know, everyone agrees that Django's webpage needs to be rebuilt. It has been a major slog to get everybody in the room at the same time and agree on what's going to happen. And it's happening. It's just happening very, very slowly, and that can be a very frustrating process of dragging things out. You know, much like I said in my talk, you know, just because you turn up and ask a question or submit a suggestion doesn't mean you get everyone's attention straight away. And it's not just for you; it's for me as well. You know, I have lots of great ideas that people ignore, and it's because they're volunteers. I'm a volunteer. Our volunteering time needs to intersect at the same time as our interest in order for something to progress. So you need to be persistent to make this sort of stuff happen. And if you want things to happen quickly, which you always do because you've got such great ideas, it's frustrating when that doesn't happen. The brightest moments, the happiest moments, are actually the things about community. Like I said, the first conference that I went to, DjangoCon, was the first time that I had met anybody in the Django community. And all of a sudden I was in a room with 250 Django developers, and the energy in the room is phenomenal, because all of a sudden here's 250 people who are actively using something you've contributed to. That's an amazing feeling, because you're actually getting direct feedback from people who are like-minded, know the same things you do, like the same things you do from a software engineering perspective, but also have lots of different experiences and lots of different interests. And that sense of community around the product, around the software, around the community of developers who use and contribute to the product is an incredibly electrifying thing. It's a real buzz to be involved in a large community like that. Good on.
I think for me, if I try to theorize about it, the most difficult situations I had to face, or the most bad situations or something like that, they were all related to communication, social conflicts, actually. I was working in a team, and we kind of, maybe it was like involving lots of money, whatever, but that's not really the important point. I had a strong relation to these people, and we like strongly disagreed on something, on how to proceed, up to the point that there was an imminent split. Right? And there's many, many ways on how you can get into conflicts. And it requires a lot of, practice on the one hand, and kind of like taking yourself back, trying to find solutions. But it can also, sometimes it can be the right solution to actually split. It's not like you always have to stick together. But in any case, it's really the worst things that happened usually related to this and not to a technical problem. So like a technical problem in the sense of something didn't work, if I was encountering that, I never really felt completely bad. It's anyway the fault of the machine, right? But the social aspect is really, really hard. And I think no matter what you're going to do, like if you're going to work like in open source contexts or in company contexts, you will find that the social aspect, like you're having a department meeting or something like this, you're having a meeting and you kind of like are developing a project and somebody else is doing something that endangers your project, or you know that the action of that person actually means that what you've done is going to not count. You know, it's going to be not used, although it's the better solution, right? And things like this. And these kinds of conflicts, they're usually really hard to get through. And that also can happen in open source. I mean, that's not like that's a human thing, right? It all depends on kind of communication skills and in some of these situations, actually, the people I was working with, there were some very good people who managed to moderate between groups. So as long as there's some kind of common goal, a common interest, and you can actually remind people, okay, but we all share a common interest, you can usually find a way to go around this. But it's a whole topic. I mean, we can have a whole lecture about just this topic. The best things, actually, similar as to Russell, also for me happened in reverse. When I realized that something I did was very positive to many people, and I get like lots of good feedback, right? That's a very good feeling, because I know I'm doing something useful. And maybe I'm even getting money for that, even better, right? But it's not only that. It's kind of like, I'm happy if people think what I'm doing is actually useful, right? So, and I've had some very good situations in that, like when I did the PyPy project or some other bits, or when I give talks and I get like, you know, some kind of positive feedbacks. That's a very nice thing to do, to have. And that's the positive aspect. So you see it's both about the social aspects of working together. Of course, I also have some things in the technical manner, but that requires a bit more like telling about this. But I think these are very two, I mean, social interaction is like, it's like happening everywhere, and that's going to be the main source of your frustration, and it's also going to be the main source of feeling good. So do think about it, do reflect about your behavior, I would say. I'm trying to do that still. Like, I'm still learning. It's not, I'm not done or something. It's an ongoing problem all the time.
First, thank you for the Django. My job totally it's about Django. And my question about Microsoft, maybe about a big company. For example, I'm a small open source programmer, and I have and I think, oh, it's a cool idea from some big company, and I can do this my way, and I can do this open source, and it will be maybe better than their product. And could I be aware from a lawyer? Because I know I really don't know anything about rights, about the license. And could I be aware about these things? And
sure. Okay. The short answer is yes, you may be susceptible, but it's very, very hard to say without specifics. You know, the software patents, particularly in the United States, are a serious problem. And unfortunately, I don't really have any good advice on how to deal with that other than don't worry about it. Because if you're small, Microsoft, whoever, isn't going to care about you. If you're big, other people will get your back. Like there was an example, this isn't so much about patents, but with trademarks. Just recently, the Python community in Europe had a very big problem because technically they don't own the trademark to the word Python in Europe. And a company registered, in 1997, registered the python.co.uk domain name. And this is despite the fact that Python as a language has existed since 1991, something like that, yeah. So Python as a language has been around since 1991. It's being used actively in Europe. It was invented in Europe. Prior to 1997, when python.co.uk was registered, the company that registered the domain just kind of sat on it. They were using it to redirect to something else, mailbox software, something. And they made an announcement that they were going to try and release this cloud computing platform called Python Cloud, which is a problem because the number of cloud computing companies that are using Python is non-trivial. And they claimed they were going to get a trademark on Python as applied to computing and computing services and server software and so on. Now, if Python was, the Python project was one guy in a garage, then okay, that may have been game over, but it was one guy in a garage, so yeah, it's unfortunate, but that guy can change the name of his project. What actually happened is that the Python community came up and said, okay, we need a little bit of help here. We need demonstrations of prior art. We need documented proof that the Python name has been used for computing prior to 1997. And they got flooded with examples. Now, the Python community is big. There are a lot of people who have been using Python for a long time. And they basically completely crushed the trademark application in a matter of days, just by the fact that people became aware that it was an issue. I suspect you'd find a similar sort of thing is going to happen with any patent application. Any patent will essentially be invalidated if you can demonstrate prior art. And technically, it won't be invalidated until that's done in a legal setting. But if you've got a project of any size and that community can get together and sort of find the great big stack of prior art that completely invalidates the patent, then the lawyers for the big company are going to basically say, no, you're not going to win, and walk away from the case and not worry about it. So technically, yes, you're right, it is a problem. I wouldn't be concerned. Unless you are actively going out of your way to say, I'm going to copy this thing, in which case, yeah, you're in some interesting dubious ground. If you're trying to say, here is a solution to a problem and I'm going to approach it in a similar way, I suspect you'll find you're completely safe. In practice, completely safe.
Just a little addition. When it comes to copyright and copyright laws, which are very strict, as you probably know, in many places, I find it very funny, actually, that the only cases I've encountered of violating copyright is usually in commercial companies, not in the open source scene, right? Because people publishing their code under an open source license, they're putting it out publicly for others to see, right? So they run a high risk if they actually copy something and put this into their code, and they don't actually have the license to do that they get a problem. Whereas many companies actually don't care. They take all of these open source pool, and it does come with a license. Not all open source is equal. There are different licenses, right? And they just take it and put it into their product and then sell it. And sometimes that might be permitted by the license and sometimes not. But I've seen many cases where they just didn't care. They had no awareness that parts of their source code was actually, written by someone else. So actually, if there are, especially related to copyright, if there are problems, it's typically actually in the commercial companies and the commercial products, very seldomly in the open source field. If there is something, it just gets fixed and it just gets thrown out, replaced, and it's done with. So when it comes to copyright, I would actually say it's much safer for a company to use open source in many respects than using commercial kind of libraries and putting this into your product. You might actually have many more problems there. And when it comes to patents, yes, I mean, patents are a mess, especially in the US, but even there, it's currently in the Constitutional Court. And there's even Microsoft and Google and so on there, even they have an interest to actually get away from this patent craziness. And one thing, if you don't care about patents, it's usually better because if you actually read a patent and you violate it, you have to pay 3 times as much money as if you hadn't violated that, right? So rather stay kind of ignorant, and if you can basically say, no, I just invented that, I didn't actually, I pushed it to that mailing list and I just, wrote it, I didn't know, then you're actually in a better position. And also, well, you're not completely safe, but nobody's going to sue you as an individual developer. I mean, if you look at the patent suits, it's really against Google. I mean, Oracle trying to get Google because they have much money, right, to get from. No company actually gets much from, a single developer or things like this. And large communities can help themselves, like Russell said. So I think it's not a reason to be too worried about.
Maybe you know. How do you think, what is business expectations about open source now? Is it an open source for solving trivial problems, or it's a part of infrastructure? So how do you think?
Well, you mean the selling point of open source, or what is exactly your question? Can you? Yes. Expectations about open source, yes. Well, I think for many big companies that I had contact with, for them the expectation is to get a solid product that they can use for free and like use it in their infrastructure. And many companies do it this way, and other companies actually start, or some companies, but it's the minority, they actually start to realize they can actually modify it and also give something back, or in order to, like there's many open source foundations, and there's a number of companies actually giving donations to the foundations for the open source software because they realize they actually depend on it, right? I mean, there's many companies depending on Postgres. There's many companies depending on Python and so on. And the foundations that have been founded then for these particular communities, they usually receive like $10,000 donations by a company who says, okay, we are making millions using this technology. We want this community to exist, and that's why we give back, right? So that's like the higher insight into this process. But most companies usually start by, oh, it's free, cool, we're just going to use it, right? And that's why they end up with like most of their stuff is just open source, and they just try to integrate it. It's not, I mean, why not? Nobody loses by them doing that, right? But they can get to a higher level if they realize they can change it and they can, you know, help sustain it. Yes.
Our group, we're studying Python. We have just started with it, and I would like to know your personal opinion. What you don't like in Python? What things?
Okay, so this is really a matter about Python, the language, what we don't like about Python. Okay, you just want to have my personal opinion on that? Okay. I think the one thing I dislike about Python is that it hasn't really three things. I mean, if you ask any software developer who's involved in any kind of software project about what you don't like about your project, you're not going to have to wait long, right, to get a number of answers. I mean, it's... one thing. I think that the model with which the standard library that comes with a Python install is packaged and developed is not a very good one, and it doesn't fit the current situation. Does it make sense to you? Okay. So what I would prefer, for example, is a standard library model that works on putting together existing good projects that that are used actively in the Python community, put this together in some kind of like standard library repository, and then package that with Python releases. And keep it backward compatible to previous Python versions, so that people can actually start to use the standard library across Python versions, so that it's easier for everyone also to contribute to the standard library, to improve it, and to use it in their environment, as opposed to just in future Python versions. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the standard library was a good idea to just package it. But there was no kind of downloading packages from the internet and things like this. But the model is basically not fitting anymore, in my opinion, in many ways. So 1. 2, language level concurrency. All the new good languages that are out there, and including Python also have a module, they work with some time of asynchronous programming. That means, or evented programming. You probably have heard of that. So the traditional model, like in the 90s, maybe was building applications where you have an operating system thread, that a thread of execution, and it's managed by the kernel. And Linux got famous because it was very fast in doing that. But the problem is that the language level where you can do that is like, where you can also do that in terms of cooperative multi-threading, is like 1,000 times faster, you know? So if you look at something like what CCP Games is doing in Iceland with a massive multiplayer game, they're using language levels and concurrency, and they hold, using Python, stackless Python, and they hold the world record of how many players and connection you can keep on one server, in one world. Like if you look at Warcraft and other things, they have, like 2 years ago already, they had 40,000 people in one world actually connected and coordinated through a single instance of their cluster. And that was doable by this kind of like language level concurrency. With operating system threads, no chance. It was 2, language level concurrency. No, you. we can go on like this.
Oh yes, forever. Okay, the two for me. The first one is sort of the double-edged sword of the whitespace dependent syntax. On the one hand, I really, really like it because it enforces good discipline on everyone writing code the same way. You stop having arguments about where the braces go and all those sort of things. But it means that certain linguistic constructs get very, very inelegant. The good example is like Ruby. Ruby has blocks, if you've looked into Ruby. It's a way of sort of injecting anonymous functions into code. As a language construct, it's a very elegant way of building certain things, but it's not something that anyone's come up with a good syntax to make it elegant to describe that in Python, at least as an anonymous level. So it's the constraints that the whitespace sensitive syntax imposes on you is kind of the fact that is then restricting the way the language can evolve in certain ways is sort of one thing. The other is, well, I also would back up Olga's thing about the concurrency, the fact that it doesn't have a good concurrency model at the moment. The other one is, and it's not so much about the language itself, but more about the language environments and the places where Python can be used. Python is great on the server. It is being used in Django. It is a fantastic language to use in the server. And I think it is a good language, period. But you can't use it in the browser. You can't use it on mobile. You can't use it on an iOS device. You can't use it on Android because it's not part of the native toolchain anywhere except on servers where you don't have to care what the client has. I would very much like to see Python be able to make a decision at an engineering level. I want to use the best language that I can get access to on my platform of choice. And at the moment, Python doesn't have a good story on anything other than a server where you control everything. You can't use it in the browser. You can't use it on mobile. And looking forward, projecting forward, I think that's one of the biggest risks that Python has, because the next generation of computing, there's going to be a lot more mobile and a lot more browser work going on, and yet Python can't target them. So that annoys me at a sort of it's not about Python specifically as a language, it's about how you can use Python, and that constraint is something that I'm very worried about. Another 3?
Enough, or do you want some more? Okay.
I think it's the last question.
Я бы хотел воспользоваться услугами вашей помощи. Вот было упомянуто о том, что компании платят сообществам разработчиков donations. И вот хотелось бы узнать о процессе создания таких сообществ. Кто там этим всем процессом руководит и принимает какие-то решения и так далее.
Как раз специальный доклад на эту тему, и он длился 45 минут.
Попросите наше время быть в 2 предложениях, можно сказать.
Нет, на самом деле мы выложим видео с пайкодом, можно будет там это посмотреть. Я, конечно, попрошу сейчас такое short summary. So the question is you mentioned that companies donate to open source developers so that they can develop their open source more. And the question is how it's all organized, the process and what people
do,
what was the structure and so on. So I told him that you had to talk about it at PyCon, and we'll give video and it takes 45 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I can give the brief here.
But you can, yeah, you can share a short summary.
Okay, so the short version is that the Django Software Foundation exists as a not-for-profit organisation, so it's a not-for-profit corporation registered in the United States, and companies can donate to the foundation and be called members of the foundation. That means that we then have money that we can use to pay for development to be done, or necessary tasks to be done, or pay for the lawyers, or pay for, sponsor the food at a particular developer event or something like that. That's Django's process specifically. We only have at the moment a foundation set up in the United States. You look at other organisations, the larger the organisation, the broader they are. So you can have the Free Software Foundation, for example, has a US presence and a European presence, an Australian presence, an Asian presence. So the rules, exactly how the money is received, exactly how the money is distributed, varies from community to community. But generally, the sort of general experience is that because it is a not-for-profit, there are rules around. Essentially, you can't be doing commercial activity. So you can't say, if you give us $1,000, we will give you this feature. But we can say, if you'll give us $1,000, it will contribute to our efforts to develop broader features, one of which may be this one. So yeah, it gets a bit messy. Holger's probably got some.
Yeah. Extending on that, I'm in the PyPy project, this compiler thing. We got EU funding, actually research funding for developing a lot of the algorithms. That is one thing, like public sources for that. We didn't have a foundation at that time. We are using a foundation model to help us pay developers. What we do is we put out proposals that you find at pypy.org. And this proposal, which is just a one-page thing, we say, we as a community think it makes sense to support NumPy for scientific computing on PyPy. We think it makes sense to port our code base to Python 3, second proposal. Third proposal, we think it makes sense to support software transactional memory with Python, right? These are 3 different proposals we had in the last 1.5 years. Then we put them out, and we ask people and companies to donate to this cause. What they get in return is that our kind of promise that we're going to work on that. They don't get a promise of, like, we're going to be successful, or we're going to be delivering something that is useful to them, right? And we put out the proposal first because we think as a community it makes sense. And then we find people to actually donate to it so that we do it. That's required also for non-profit. If it works the other way around, the company comes to us and says, we want this feature, you know. There's basically no way how you can organize that for a non-profit. Then you are a company, which is fine. I mean, you can just, if that happens, and foundations have that sometimes, they just say, okay, go to that company, they're going to build it for you, right? But the non-profit part, for-profit part is doing these proposals, and it has worked for many, many open source projects already, like Samba and Twisted, and many projects that actually do it this way. And it's currently, I would say, a successful model. And we have companies like in the last 1.5 years, we raised something like $100,000 with that. So some companies say, yes, we want to see this happen. Here's $10,000, and please make it happen. It doesn't mean that everything is great, but I mean, it's not so easy to get money from companies sometimes, because they think, oh, if we don't give the money, then maybe they will still do it. So, But it's also, I mean, some companies actually get to this higher insight. It actually makes sense to support a project, because if they don't do it, then maybe it doesn't fail now, but it might fail in a couple of years. And if they're depending on that product, they might actually suffer themselves. So if they are starting to get these insights with all of these open source projects, I think more and more companies realize it makes some sense to also give something back, right? Okay, you make the closing word. I don't know.
Thank you very much for coming. I think.